What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and this is going to be a Magicka Warden build that's kind of centered around beating Maelstrom Arena. The Magicka Warden is actually not a terrible class to use when it comes to trying to clear Maelstrom Arena. You have access to a pet with the bear ultimate, so that can draw some of the aggro away from you. It also does a lot of good damage. You have access to a self-heal, and your shields are actually not that bad. Plus you get some additional sustain from your Blue Betty, which also helps clear your debuffs. So learning Maelstrom Arena, learning how to clear Maelstrom Arena, and learning the mechanics on a Magicka Warden actually isn't that bad of a choice here. It's definitely going to fall short of a Magicka Sorcerer when it comes to how easy it is, but it's definitely a very good option if you're just looking to get a VMA clear, whether you want a tune that's just designed around farming for your Maelstrom Bow, your Maelstrom Staves for your Magicka DPS. So like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gears, our CP point distributions, our skill bars. We'll be going over race, attributes, food, things like that. A lot of that, the secondary stuff, it really isn't going to matter too much if you're just going for Maelstrom clears. Maelstrom Arena, while it does have a couple of DPS checks, they're not particularly difficult to pass, so you're not necessarily going to need to min-max your race, for instance, compared to something like Vet Trials hard modes, where you are going to need to push out potentially more DPS than you would in Maelstrom Arena. And unlike our other build videos, I actually will not be doing a 6-man dummy parse because this build really isn't optimized around endgame PvE content. You're not really going to be necessarily bringing this build into vet trials. You certainly can. This build actually pulls enough DPS to clear the vet trials, a lot of the vet trials content, but it's not really optimized around that. If you want a Magicka Warden build that's more optimized around completing vet trials, go ahead and check out the Magicka Warden build video, Nature's Fury, that I have somewhere on the build playlist. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this build. So we'll start off with gear here. So when it comes to monster helms, you have a couple of options here. I have Nerien'eth here. That's mainly because you're going to be using Force Pulse with an Asylum Staff, so we do have a lot of direct damage hits, so Nerien'eth will proc fairly often. However, it's not necessarily going to be the strongest option here because it does take 2 seconds in order for the Lich Crystal to explode and deal that damage, so that's something you want to take into consideration. Another option that you might want to use for a monster helm is going to be Skoria. It still gives you max health for the 1 piece, and the 2-piece, when you deal damage with the damage over time ability, you have 8% chance to summon a meteor that deals direct damage to a target and then additional damage to all enemies within 5 meters. So this is definitely going to be a guaranteed hit on whichever mob it's targeted, plus it deals a little bit less damage to enemies around it within 5 meters, so it's not quite as strong in AoE with Nerien'eth, but it's going to be a lot more reliable that way. So those are kind of your 2 monster helm options here. You can also go with something like, tried and true Ilambris. You can go with Grothdarr. Realistically, you can use any monster helm set as long as it's Magicka inclined. I would probably shy away from using something like Zan though, because that's a single target thing. And I'd probably stick with something like Nerien'eth or Skoria, even though they don't give you any sort of DPS boost for the 1 piece. In Maelstrom Arena, it's going to be a lot more learning how to survive and learning the mechanics, so having that additional health will really help your survivability here. For our 5-piece, we're going with Necropotence. It is a dropped set from Rivenspire, so you can purchase it off of Guild Traders. Don't feel like you necessarily need to use Divines. I have Divines on all my pieces here. But you don't necessarily have to do it. So like I said earlier, Maelstrom Arena does have a few DPS checks, but they're not terribly difficult to meet. It's not something like, 45k or something like that for, Vhoff hard mode execute or something like that. It's pretty reasonable. It's probably closer to around 15 to 20k. If you can hit DPS around that margin, then you should be fine and you will be able to clear VMA. Maybe not very quickly, but if you're just going for clears and not going for score, that's perfectly fine. So don't feel like you have to use Divines. You can use other traits if you'd like. Infused is a perfectly fine trait to use on your large pieces. Just don't feel like you have to buy them. As you can see here with the Master Merchant prices here, they can get pretty pricey here, so don't feel like you have to buy the Divines pieces or farm for the Divine pieces if you just kind of want to go straight into VMA and get that clear. For our jewelry, we're going with 3-piece Willpower. 2 of them have spell damage enchants, and 1 of them has a Magicka regen enchant. So Magicka Wardens, even though we do have access to the Blue Betty, which does help our sustain a little bit, we still suffer from regen issues, so that's why we have that 1 regen glyph here. It just helps out our sustain, and depending on the food you're using, that regen glyph could come in pretty handy here. So I'll talk about food in a little bit here. So when you're going with Willpower, make sure, since you can buy it off of Guild Traders, make sure you're purchasing the Arcane version, not Robust or Healthy, because you do want that additional Magicka to help boost your DPS by a little bit there. Now for our front bar, we're going with the Asylum's Inferno Staff. Asylum's you will need to have access to the Clockwork City DLC in order to get the Asylum Staff, so you will need ESO+. If you don't have access to ESO+, or Clockwork City, then you can just use any old Inferno Staff. It just has to be infused with a shock damage enchant. The Asylum Staff does drop from normal Asylum, so you don't feel like you have to go through vet. You can just run it through on normal. It's a fairly quick trial if you're in a group that knows what they're doing and has pretty good DPS. You can probably clear it in like 15 to 20 minutes if you are in a good group. So try to pick up an Asylum's Inferno if you can. If you can't, then just go with something like a Ruby Ash Inferno Staff. The most important thing is to make sure that the weapon is gold and it is infused with a shock damage enchant here. For your back bar, you are also going to be going with an Inferno Staff. You don't have to go with Inferno if you don't want to. You can actually go with the Lightning Staff instead. It's kind of up to you which one you want to go with. So this is Inferno Staff Julianos with an infused fire damage enchant. You don't have to use a fire damage enchant if you would like, but you will find that in Maelstrom Arena, it's going to be a lot more important to have greater burst DPS than it is to have greater sustained DPS. So the flame damage enchant will give you a little bit better burst compared to using a weapon damage enchant. So that's why we're using that there. Again, you can use a Lightning Staff, and you don't need to have it in any particular set, so it can just be, a plain Ruby Ash Lightning Staff, infused with a flame damage enchant here. So that's pretty much it. So you do have one option, alternative here for Necropotence. You can go with Master Architect if you'd like. That's going to be a little bit more advanced, so once you get a little bit hang of VMA, you can start shifting from Necropotence away from Necropotence and with Master Architect instead. But you will need to farm the Halls of Fabrication on normal in order to get the pieces, so I would just stick with Necropotence because you can just buy that. You don't necessarily have to run through Halls of Fabrication multiple times to get your 5-piece Master Architect set. But that is a viable alternative here if you don't want to spend money on Necropotence, if you just want to farm Halls of Fabrication for a Master Architect set. So like I said earlier, these secondary things are not really going to matter too much if you're going to go for clears. Now if this is a tune that you're going to also want to bring to, endgame vet trials, things like that, then of course this is going to be something that you're going to want to take into consideration. So I am a Dark Elf here, but you can use any of the magically inclined races, so Altmer, you can go with Argonians, you can go with Bretons if you'd like, if you want to bring this tune to endgame vet trials, then try to stick with Dark Elves or the High Elves. Those will give you the best DPS returns, but Bretons and Argonians are not a bad choice if you want to give yourself the biggest advantage, as much of an advantage as you can. But realistically, you can clear VMA on any race, so don't feel like you need to be tied down to those 4 races there. For attributes, 64 points into Magicka and none into health. So just like our typical PvE endgame vet trials builds, if you need to shift a couple of points into health because you feel like you're dying too much, then by all means go ahead. Like I said, the DPS checks in Maelstrom Arena are not terribly high. Like I said, around 15 and 20k DPS is more than enough to clear Maelstrom Arena. So you can shift a couple points into health if you feel like you need that additional survivability. Now for our Mundus, we're going to be going with the Lover, and we're actually going to be sticking with the Lover. So remember that the Maelstrom Arena is solo content, so you don't have access necessarily to Elemental Drain from a healer, you won't have access to Crusher from a tank. Those debuffs are only going to be present if you are personally going to be running them. And depending on how comfortable you are, you might not be running something like that. So in this particular build, we're running Shock and Flame enchant. You could use a Crusher enchant if you'd like, but like I said, it's going to be more important to have higher burst DPS than it is going to be having higher sustained DPS. So the Flame and the Shock damage enchants are going to be a little bit stronger here. The best way to improve our DPS then is going to be running the Lover instead of the Apprentice. So on top of not having any sort of group debuffs available, that ties into penetration, so you're not going to have Ellie Drain. So the only sorts of penetration you have right now is your 100 base penetration and the 4884 from the light armor passive. So you want as much penetration as you can. Now the bosses in Maelstrom Arena have kind of varying degrees of resistances. So for example, the last boss, the final boss in Maelstrom Arena, has only 9100 resistances. However, I believe like boss 4 on stage 4, that has the full 18,200 resistances. So you're just going to want to try to get as much penetration as you can by yourself. So you know, you're going to be running the Lover. You might be putting a lot of more points into spell erosion compared to, you know, an endgame PvE build. So that's something you're going to want to take into consideration here. So with the Lover and the light armor passive plus the 100 base penetration, you will be sitting at about 9,000 penetration, which is, you know, enough to get past, I believe, 3 out of the 9. Well, yeah, 3 out of the 9 bosses, because they only have 9100 penetration. And so for the rest of the bosses, at least you will be able to cut through their resistances much better with Lover compared to something like the Apprentice. Now for food, you have 2 options here. So I'm using Witchmother's Potent Brew here, but you can go with blue food, so that's max health, max magicka. Witchmother's Potent Brew, I would only recommend once you get a better hang of the mechanics behind Maelstrom Arena. Because of the lower health that it gives you, you're going to be pretty much a little bit more squishy compared to if you're running blue food, which gives you much more health. But in return for using blue food, you lose the magicka regen. So that's something you want to take into consideration there. If you do decide to use blue food, your sustain is going to take a hit. It's going to be actually a pretty hefty hit. So you're going to need to learn how to heavy attack, and you're going to try to, you know, learn to find opportunities to heavy attack here and there in order to maintain your magicka. This build, like I said, the sustain isn't quite as good because we are using Force Pulse / Crushing Shock as our main spam bull here. For our skill bars now, let's start with our front bar here. We have Harness Magicka. You can go with Dampen Magic if you'd like. It's kind of up to you which morph you want to choose. With Harness Magicka though, you do get the additional sustain when you take damage while the shield is up from any sort of spell projectile. So that's really useful to have, especially in vMA, because it'll definitely be a test of your sustain as much as it is for your DPS and survivability. So having that additional sustain here is going to be a little bit helpful. But you can run Dampen Magic if you'd like, if you feel like you don't need that additional sustain from Harness Magicka. Crushing Shock here, you can use Force Pulse instead. I just prefer to use Crushing Shock because it has that range interrupt, so that's very useful to have. So that's really useful here, especially in VMA. There are going to be a couple of mechanics that you can't interrupt here, but sometimes you have to be a little bit careful that you don't interrupt an ability. So for Stage 7, for instance, the final boss in Stage 7 has a mechanic that you can actually interrupt, but you're not going to want to interrupt it because during that mechanic phase he's actually enraged, and if you interrupt it early, he'll actually keep that enrage over, and his normal attacks are going to hit for really, really hard. So that's something you're going to just want to keep in mind. Just bear that in mind, but generally speaking, the interrupt and Crushing Shock can be very, very helpful. Fetcher Infection, this is just a dot that you can run. You aren't going to be really casting this all too much because it'll only infect one enemy. This is going to be more used for the boss fights on each stage. So that's something that you're not really going to be seeing too much of during the rounds leading up to the boss here. So just save this really for the boss rounds. Otherwise, just don't use it at all to help conserve your magicka. Inner Light here is pretty self-explanatory why it's here. And we have Bird of Prey. So Bird of Prey, you can use it if you'd like because it does give you Minor Berserk, which helps out your DPS. But just like Fetcher Infection, this is going to be more used for boss fights where you're going to want that extra DPS. The rounds leading up to the final boss, you're not necessarily going to need Minor Berserk at all. So I would recommend just not running Bird of Prey, or not using Bird of Prey, I should say, during the lead-up rounds to the final bosses of those stages, just because it does cost a hefty amount of magicka here, almost 3,000 magicka, so it is going to be a hit of a sustain if you're going to be using it every 10 seconds. Then our ultimate here is obviously going to be Guardian's Wrath, so Eternal Guardian. For our back bar, we have Winter's Revenge and Blockade of Fire. These are our 2 dots that we're going to want to keep up. This is going to help proc Skoria if you're going to be using Skoria. Plus it is an AoE. They both are AoEs, so they'll help deal with the trash between boss fights. Blue Betty, this is pretty obvious. We want this for the additional magicka regen. Plus, whenever it's summoned, it can remove a negative effect from you. It is random which negative effect that it removes, so you might need to spam Blue Betty to get all of them off. But it's nice to have that extra additional utility there. Inner Light again it's pretty self-explanatory, and Lotus Blossom. This is going to be pretty important actually in VMA, because it will restore health to you whenever you do a light attack or a heavy attack on an enemy. So you want to try to keep this up as much as you can during VMA, so you get that additional heal, and you're definitely going to want to hit your light weaves and in order to get your health back up. So a common strategy that I use is when I need to heal is just keep my shield up, make sure Lotus Blossom is up, and then just don't even bother using abilities, just spam my light attack so I can get my health back up. So that's this ability right here is pretty important to maintain during VMA, and for ultimate we do have to double bar the bear ultimate. Now for our CPs, these are pretty much identical between this, or not identical, but they're very similar between this and the endgame PvE Trials build. So with the Lover, two important nodes to get are going to be Arcanist and Tenacity. Make sure to get 75 points into both of them. And then that you can put the 90 points wherever. So for example, I have 31 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, and 28 Warlord. That's just to help conserve stamina. You won't really be using too much Breaking Free, so if you want you can put a couple more points into Tumbling and Shadow Ward, so that reduces the stamina that cost of blocking and breaking and dodge rolling, so that way you'll be able to block, cast a little bit more during VMA. So that's something that you should consider doing. Now for our blue CPs, so this again is a little bit different compared to the endgame PvE build. So this is kind of centered around having a little bit of additional penetration from spell erosion, but we're still trying to maximize the DPS by running plenty of points into Elemental Expert and Elfborn here. If you want, you can shift a couple of points out of these these nodes here. For example, you can take this 9 out of Staff Expert here and put them into spell erosion to help you out with those bosses with a little bit higher resistances, but you don't have to necessarily do it. So this running the Lover and having a couple of points here in a spell erosion is usually going to be enough to get your DPS over any DPS checks that you might have to hit. So I have 56 into Elfborn, 64 into Elemental Expert, 11 into Spell Erosion, 9 into Staff Expert, 66 into Master at Arms, and 34 into Thaumaturge. Now I do realize that some of you guys who are going to be clearing VMA for the first time aren't necessarily going to have max CP like I have here, so take a look at my take a look at how many CPs you have, and then adjust accordingly. So Elemental Expert's going to be very important to invest points into. This is going to give you the best return when it comes to how many CP points you're putting into it. And again, you can put a couple points into Spell Erosion here if you'd like. You don't need that many points into Staff Expert, as you can tell from the only 9 points there. Master at Arms is again going to be a pretty powerful passive here, as is going to be Elfborn. Thaumaturge can be fairly useful, but it's not going to be, your dots aren't actually going to be a huge source of damage here, so that's something you want to take into consideration there. So take a look at your your CPs and kind of adjust accordingly. Blue CP distribution, you don't have to really optimize it too much for VMA. Like I said, the DPS checks aren't terribly high there. Now for our red CPs, so I take a one-size-fits-most approach, and this is going to be a very balanced approach. So in VMA, you're going to be taking damage from multiple sources, both physical and magical damage. So I would recommend going for a much more balanced approach, but you will take, generally speaking, the Magicka enemies in VMA are going to be a little bit more damaging than physical enemies, so the mages and stuff. So you might want to take a couple of points out of Hardy and put them in Elemental Defender or Ironclad or Spell Shield if you're finding yourself having trouble surviving, because generally speaking, if you're dying a lot, it's probably going to be from Magicka, your Magicka mobs. So if you do happen to die fairly often, just take a look at your death recap, and if it is, a magic ability that's killing you, a lot of you see pretty big hits from Magicka abilities, then go to the Way Shrine and take some time to shift your red CP points around, to kind of make up for that. So I have 40 into Ironclad 1 to Spell Shield, 48 into Thick Skin, 56 into both Hardy and Elemental Defender, and then I have 31 points into Bastion. And again, I do realize not all of you guys have max CP like I do. Well, probably a lot of you guys are probably sitting at around 300, 400 CPs. So again, for your red CPs, I'll take a very balanced approach, but you don't have to. You can put a couple more points into Elemental Defender instead of Hardy if you'd like. I would definitely focus points onto Hardy and Elemental Defender first, as well as Ironclad. Those are probably going to be the 3 biggest returns when it comes to damage reduction CP passives. You won't really be seeing that many dots when it comes to VMA, so you don't necessarily need to put that many points into Thick Skinned. It's nice to have a couple of points there because there are going to be a few dots, but they're generally, again, not going to be all too dangerous to you. Let's Now that we have all the build stuff out of the way, I'll show you guys kind of what how you kind of want to approach VMA on a Magicka Warden. So the 3 skills that you're going to want to maintain or try to maintain at all times are going to be your Blue Betty, Lotus Blossom, and Harness Magicka or Dampen Magic here. These are going to be pretty important to your overall success in VMA. Blue Betty for the sustain, Lotus Blossom for the heal, and Harness Magicka for survivability. So basically, you don't really have that much of a set rotation because, again, you're not really facing off against one big boss. You're facing off against trash pulls, and then you have sort of a mini boss at the end of each round. And at the last round for each stage is going to be a big, a medium-sized boss, so to speak. So, it is solo content. So, not all of them are going to have 3 million health. The highest amount of health that a boss has in VMA is going to be around 1 million. So, that's something you just want to take into consideration. That's not really enough time really to do complex, full rotations. So, just want to make sure you have Blue Betty, Lotus Blossom up as much as you can. Keep your shield up as much as you can. And then, lay down your dots. And then use Force Pulse. Again, unless it's going to be the boss round, you're not going to want to use Fetcher, Infection, or Bird of Prey. If it is a boss round, then by all means, go with the full rotation. The whole 9 yards. And then when you have your ultimate up, since it's so cheap, the bear ultimate is incredibly cheap. Just use your ultimate on cooldown. Doesn't really matter if it's on a mob or if it's on a boss. It's 75 ultimate, and you're gaining ultimate pretty fast. So, don't feel like you need to necessarily skimp on the ultimate. You can keep using it as much as you want. As soon as it's up, target a mob, use it. Because the bear is incredibly powerful, and it will hit for a pretty good margin. So if you take a look here, under combat report, you can see that the bear, is doing a pretty decent amount of damage here. And if you look at the ultimate here that we used, it did 31k. So, and this is the heavy attack here that it does every once in a while. It does 14k. So, using your ultimate can easily kill a mob. In the earlier stages, and on the later stages, it can wipe out 60 to 70% of its health, making it a lot simpler to take out those priority mobs on each of the later stages there. For example, the crematorial guards. So, like I said, we're not going to be doing a 6 million dummy parse because, again, this is not really optimized for, PvE and endgame. This is more optimized for just trying to get through VMA. So, that's pretty much it for this build video. I will have a link down in the description below for a stage for the playlist with a stage-by-stage kind of playbook for VMA. I know it is a bit old, so I am in the process of updating it, but all the mechanics are still exactly the same. I am using a different Sorc build compared to the VMA Sorc build that I have posted on the build site here, builds playlist here, but although, the mechanics are going to be exactly the same, and you can use plenty of different combination of sets in order to get through Maelstrom Arena, so don't feel like, just because I'm using a different gear setup that this set, you have to follow that. So just kind of focus in on surviving, focus in on survivability. Don't really focus too much on increasing your DPS in Maelstrom Arena. The most important thing to success in Maelstrom Arena is patience, because it is going to be fairly long. It took me, I believe, like 4 or 5 hours for my first clear. So I had to be patient, and kind of learn the mechanics, things like that. I did prepare beforehand, but all the written guides in the world can't prepare you for the real thing. So make sure to come in with a lot of patience. Remember that you can step away from Maelstrom Arena and it'll still save your stage progression. So don't feel like you have to do it all in one sitting like I did. I do not recommend doing that for your first clear. And just relax and focus on surviving and getting the mechanics down pat for each stage. Once you get the mechanics down for VMA, it becomes so much easier. So that's it for this video. Good luck for all of you guys who are going for your first VMA clear, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.